You know it's this. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowing like sis. Then it perfect in the kid. Got a billion new single, my hate on the better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper than
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the third part of What If Deku Finds Powerpuff Girls in MHA. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of PeriwinkleFrog on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. The first battle was Team A versus Team D. Team A consisted of Izuku and Ochako, who were the heroes. Team D consisted of Bakugou and Ida, who were the villains. Of course, people were a little nervous about the matchups, especially the girls. Oh great, I gotta watch Bakugou's battle, don't I? Ugh, Buttercup groaned. Hey, Ochako and Izuku are fighting. I hope they win, Bubbles exclaimed. What I'm hoping for is that they survive. Which, according to the matchup, they have a 6,040% chance of survival. Blossom mused. How come? Bubbles asked. Because Bakugou is their opponent. I don't know if you forgot about that moment in the quirk apprehension test, where we had to restrain Bakugou from blasting Izuku in the face, but don't be surprised if that happens again on a larger scale in this battle. PFFT. Literally no one's scared of ticking time bomb. They can handle him. The worst that could happen is an explosive tantrum. Buttercup scoffed. Perhaps? But you have to admit, ever since orientation, there's been more tension between Izuku and Bakugou. Everyone can see it. At least I can. Yeah, that's true, Bubbles admitted. Even Buttercup couldn't object to that, but she still shrugged. Well, the best thing we can hope for right now is that Izuku and Ochako give him the long-awaited royal ass whooping he deserves. Suddenly, an alarm blared, signaling the start of the battle. On one monitor, Izuku and Ochako were running inside the building and going through the hallways of the first floor. Meanwhile, the other monitor showed Bakugou and Ida standing in front of a big rocket that was the payload. The two were talking in a hushed conversation. But the moment didn't last long, as Bakugou suddenly decided to storm out angrily. Here we go, the storm is unleashed. Buttercup sighed. He's leaving Tenya to guard the payload by himself? That doesn't make sense. He should take the other team on with Bakugou, or they should both protect the payload. But they're separating, Blossom exclaimed. I get the feeling that Izuku and Ochako will win, Bubbles pointed out. Suddenly, a boom sound caused the girls to look straight at the monitors. On the hero monitor, Izuku and Ochako were recently nearly blasted by a large explosion. While the two were able to dodge, Izuku's mask had burned off a little bit by the heat. Where did that explosion come from? Bubbles squeaked. Her question seemed to be immediately answered by an angry shout that came from an even more angry Bakugou. Deku! Before Izuku was even given time to at least recover, Bakugou hits the two with another blast, which they also narrowly dodge. Bakugou was giving them little to no time to breathe as he ambushed them with explosion after explosion. Eventually, through the smoke, Ochako was fleeing around the corner of the hallway, presumably to go and find the payload while Izuku dealt with Bakugou. As the two clashed in a fiery duel, the girls looked surprised by a detail they noticed. Wow, Izuku's taking on Bakugou without using his powers, but despite that, he's technically winning, Blossom remarked. Yay, go Deku go, Bubbles cheered as she hopped up and down. But as the fight went on, Bakugou was slowly starting to gain a winning advantage. While Izuku seemed to know how to combat his fight style while powerless, he still wasn't able to combat Bakugou's fire, which was what the latter was using a lot. So, it wasn't a surprise when Izuku ended up fleeing the battle to have a chance to recover. Once Bakugou realized this, he immediately chased after Izuku, only to find that he had hidden from sight. So, Bakugou stalked the corridors, occasionally jumping into empty rooms to unleash a huge explosion in hopes of finding Izuku. As the occasional blasts made the class jump, the girls found themselves holding their breath. The battle seemed to capture their attention easily. That was because of the fighting dynamic. The battle didn't seem so dreadful, like a duel to the death. In fact, it was more comparable to a sports game. There were high stakes, incredible talent, and most of all, the fierce rivalry between opponents that came in the form of explosive combat made it very hard for the girls not to visibly root for someone, specifically the heroes, to win. And the girls weren't the only ones to think this. The entirety of Class 1 thought it too, as they held their breath with the girls. But the fun and snappy energy seemed to evaporate in an instant, when Bakugou had finally found Izuku. But after firing one rather small explosion that Izuku easily dodges, Bakugou stopped attacking, to everyone's confusion. Did he give up? What is happening? Why isn't he attacking? Buttercup asked with a frown. Blossom frowned as well. I don't know. After a second, it wasn't hard to understand what was happening. Bakugou was talking to Izuku, explaining something as he raised one of his arms. You see these gauntlets, nerd? They're designed to collect my sweat. My sweat has nitroglycerin in it, which helps with my quirk. It's also explosive. So, with all of this sweat collected in a large amount, one simple removal of this metal pin, and this all turns into the largest explosion you'll ever see. In the monitor room, some people looked confused by the sudden explanation of the costume item's purpose. But then, Bubbles was one of the first to connect the dots, and her eyes widened. It's gonna blow, she whispered. What? Blossom asked. Bubbles, what do you mean? He's gonna use his gauntlet to cause a big explosion. He's going to blast Izuku apart, Bubbles replied, her voice quavering. Buttercup's jaw nearly dropped to the floor. No way. But if he does that, he'll demolish a good half of the building. Blossom finished, eyes wide. As the whole class came to this realization, their once engaged mood turned into a panicked one. All Might quickly grabbed a microphone on the table. No, young Bakugou, don't do it. That will destroy the building, All Might ordered. If Bakugou heard the order, he clearly didn't care, as he grinned wickedly and completely yanked out the pin. What followed had to be a massive explosion of fire that completely covered the monitor in a blinding white light. And the force that followed was not only felt through the building as evidenced by the monitor in the payload room where Ida and a newly arrived Ochako were being rattled by vibrations, but it was felt in the monitor room as the walls trembled a tiny bit. The light on the monitor disappeared as quickly as it appeared, showing a now destroyed hallway filled with dust and debris. Everyone found themselves staring so intently at the monitor that was at the scene of the explosion, looking for anything that proved that the two boys had somehow survived the explosion. The room was dead silent, as fear started to take over each and every terrified classmate. But then, there was something. Rocks and debris were pushed out of the way as Izuku stood up. A split second later, Bakugou emerged from the dust too. While both boys looked rattled, Izuku far more than Bakugou, they seemed to be unharmed. This prompted a rather loud and collective sigh of relief from Class 1A. They're alive, Bubbles exclaimed. A goddamn miracle, Buttercup added. Blossom didn't say anything as she stared at the monitor, still wide-eyed. That was close. Way too close. She was obviously relieved by the goddamn miracle, as Buttercup put it, that allowed the explosion to merely destroy some of the building. But she hated to think what could have happened. Would the class have had to deal with witnessing a traumatizing injury or death? Heaven forbid at that moment, if that explosion was more deadly. Would they have been mourning not one but two lost students by the day's end? All of these scenarios and more truly cemented a fact in stone for Blossom. This school was far more deadlier than she realized. The only one who seemed to think the same way Blossom did, or at least considered what could have happened, was All Might as he spoke through the mic, his once joyful voice being one of seriousness and anger. Since no one is hurt from that explosion, I will let the battle continue. But understand me when I say this, Bakugou. You use those gauntlets again, you and your team suffer an automatic loss by disqualification and forfeit. Got it. In the monitor, Bakugou looked like he was grimacing in fury, but he obeyed, lowering his arms. Unfortunately, that didn't stop him from coming at Izuku, once again forcing the two to engage in close-quarters combat. Unlike in the hallways, Bakugou seemed to be gaining an upper hand. He clearly excelled at close-quarters combat as he dished out complicated maneuvers and explosions with no mercy. On the payload monitor, Ochako was struggling as well, trying over and over to get near the payload, only to get pushed back by Ida. As the two monitors showed Team A struggling, it seemed inevitable that Izuku and Ochako would lose. "Come on, you got this, you can do it. Beat their asses," Buttercup shouted, among the scattered Team A encouragements from some of Class 1A. Bubbles, meanwhile, buried her face into her hands with a squeak. "This is too much. I can't look," she mumbled. Just then, as Izuku was getting up slowly after being thrown to the ground, a new look appeared on his face. It resembled the face that he wore during the ball throw, a look of sheer will and determination. Only this time, a large amount of high-strung emotions, mainly anger, was mixed in with determination. Izuku was planning something. A big indicator of that was when he took a second to talk to Ochako, telling her to hold onto something tight when he gave the word. And as he tensed, he looked like he had found a new resolve to spring at bakugou. "All right, Kaken, want my firepower. You're going to get it." With that, Izuku started rushing towards bakugou, who in turn blasted towards him like a rocket. As the two drew closer and closer, green electricity ran over his arm as he readied himself for a punch. Smash! As they got close enough to attack, Izuku threw the punch. Except it wasn't directed at bakugou, who aimed an explosion at his face. It was an uppercut, and its wind force tore into the ceiling above like paper, sending debris flying up. On the payload monitor, the floor fell apart as Ochako held onto a pillar tightly and Ida wobbled, desperately trying to keep his balance. Knowing what to do, Ochako used her quirk to lessen the weight of the pillar, allowing her to tear it away. She then aimed the pillar at the flying debris with a smile. "Let's go! Comet home run!" With that, Ochako whacked the debris with the pillar, sending the debris flying at Ada. As he tried to dodge the debris, Ochako took her chance, raced past a distracted Ada, and secured the payload with a tight hug. "Got it," she whooped. This caused Class 1A to cheer, especially the girls. "Yeah, let's go. They did it," Buttercup cheered. Bubbles removed her hands from her face, confused for a second before looking ecstatic. "They won? Yes, they won." Blossom sighed as she closed her eyes. What a relief. But suddenly, the cheers abruptly stopped, as everyone looked to the other monitor. It showed bakugou backing up, pure shock apparent on his face, and across from him was Izuku, who looked heavily injured. "What? What did you do?" Bakugou said when he could finally speak. Even though he was on the brink of collapsing, Izuku answered in a weak voice. I couldn't do anything else. It was the only way. You're already too strong, Kaken, and I had no other options left. It was the only way to win." Izuku looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he ended up succumbing to exhaustion and collapsed on the ground. In the monitor room, everyone was dead silent with shock. Allmight stared at the screen for a few moments before slowly speaking through the loudspeaker. "The battle trial is now over. Team A wins the match." After the battle, nearly everyone was in some state of shock from the recent events, especially bakugou. Izuku was immediately sent to Recovery Girl, and repairs were made to the building. It had only been the first battle of the hero training exercise, and what was supposed to be something fun and engaging took on a more foreboding and frightening tone. What had to be the most confusing thing of the matter was that the class was still excited about battling, despite the fact that one of their classmates was currently suffering burn scars and broken bones from his. And, to Blossom's bewilderment, that majority included Bubbles and Buttercup. "Man, when are we going to step inside a dang building and battle?" Buttercup whined. Blossom looked at her, appalled. "Are you serious? You do realize that there's currently someone in the nurse's office with several burns and fractured bones from battling, and that knowledge doesn't make you at all concerned about the matter if that could happen to us?" "No," Buttercup answered bluntly. "Know why? Because that can't happen to us, Bloss. Sure, I'd be worried if I didn't know a handy-dandy fact that we are basically indestructible. And guess what? OMG, we are also fireproof too. What yet?" Blossom frowned, causing Buttercup to sigh. "My point is that we're tough. The most we ever gotta worry about in our battle is a stubbed toe." Blossom blinked, knowing that Buttercup had a point. After all, the girls are basically unkillable. Them getting badly hurt by, say, an explosion is about as likely as an elephant getting hurt by a mouse. When she couldn't find an objection to Buttercup's statement, Blossom relented, a little embarrassed by the fact that Buttercup was being more reasonable than her. "Okay, yeah, you're right. Just then, the girls heard a set of stomping footsteps, drawing their attention. Bakugou was marching back to the class, face dark and stormy, while Ochako and Ida followed, a little concerned. The three had recently returned from their battle. After they had stepped into the surveillance room, All Might pulled them aside to talk with them. The girls had no idea what he said, but by the looks of it, it had pissed Bakugou off. Then again, he's been nothing but furious ever since the hero studies class started. As the three joined everyone else, All Might stood in front of the group. Okay, everyone. As we all know, the previous match was a lot, to say the least. But while repairs are being made to the building and Midoriya recovers in Recovery Girl's office, we should start with our battle critique. After he said that, All Might gestured to Ida, who was taken by surprise. To start off, I'm naming Ida as the MVP of the match. Ida looked surprised before smiling. Really? Wow, okay. Thank you, sir. All Might then turned to the rest of the class. Now, who would like to tell me why that is? Almost immediately, a girl's hand went up straight in the air. Yaoyorozu, what do you think? Momo straighted upwards and started to answer in a no-nonsense tone. Tenya is MVP for numerous reasons. One of them is because of the other participants' mistakes. For Bakugou, while he had skilled quirk knowledge and constantly adapted new powerful strategies, he was far too reckless and too caught up in antagonizing Midoriya to focus on the real task of the battle trial. Bakugou looked like he was about to yell angrily at Momo, but instead decided to keep his mouth shut and settled on crossing his arms and glaring at the ground. As for Midoriya, while he was more adamant on using reckless maneuvers, he resorted to using it anyway. Because of that, he was reckless as well. For Uraraka, she let down her guard in battle too quickly, and the last move she pulled was very risky. But Ida is not only the MVP because of the mistakes made by his fellow participants. He also was a skilled strategist, as well as an excellent predictor, as he predicted that Uraraka would use anything in her surroundings as a weapon, and cleared the room of any debris. In conclusion, hard-earned skills had secured Ida the battle MVP spot. When Momo finished, everyone looked at her with a mix of shock and amazement. As the girls looked at her, Blossom recognized her as a person who was recommended for UA, which wasn't much of a surprise. She seemed really smart. I feel like we would be good friends, Blossom thought. Even All Might was shocked, but it didn't last long as he cleared his throat. Excellent, Yaoyorozu. With that settled, why don't we move on to the next battle? This time, it's Team B vs Team I. At his words, 4 people stepped forward. There was the tail guy, along with the invisible girl. There was also a boy with a strange scar on his face and bicolored hair, as well as a tall guy with multiple arms. Ah, I see. Ojiro and Hagakure, you're Team I and the villains. Shoji and Todoroki, you are Team B and the heroes. You'll be fighting in Battle Site 2, since the building's still being repaired. Now, I'll give you time for each team getting ready, so let's go. As the 4 left the room, Buttercup looked at her sisters. Well, I obviously know who I'm rooting for. Team B. I mean, you gotta admit. The guy with the mask, he looks cool. As cool as the tentacle guy is, I'm rooting for Team I. Toru's on that team and she's super nice, Bubbles replied. What about you, Blossom? Buttercup asked her. Blossom waved a hand dismissively. I'm not rooting for a team. At least, not yet. I have to know who has the advantage. You know, you have to carefully observe how powerful their quirks are, and how they can tip a battle into their favor before you can make a proper decision on who would win. Suddenly, Buttercup groaned, interrupting Blossom. Yeesh. Congratulations, Bloss. You somehow made something as cool as a super-powered battle sound boring. Bravo. Blossom clicked her tongue. Figures. Apparently everything I say is boring to you. After a few more seconds, the alarm blared again, starting the match. Quickly, Shoji and Todoroki made their way inside on one monitor, while on the other, Ojiro and Hagakure guarded the payload. On the ground floor, Shoji manipulated his arms to form ears that listened for anything that told him where the payload was. After a few seconds, he spoke to Todoroki. The payload is above us. What's the plan for getting it? Shoji said to him. Todoroki waved a dismissive hand. I already have a plan. All you need to do is step outside. Shoji frowned in confusion. Why? For your own safety. Trust me, you don't want to be here when I execute my plan. Todoroki said calmly, as if he was talking about the weather. Shoji kept up the expression a few moments more until he dropped it and sighed. Okay, Shoji said as he exited the building. Once he left the building, Todoroki simply put a hand on the wall. At his touch, ice blasted from his hand, freezing the wall. Ice completely surrounded the nearby area and started to spread everywhere throughout the building like wildfire. In the payload room, the door started to rattle. Rats! They found us already? Well, I guess we got a battle sooner than we thought. Hagakure sighed as she got into a battle position. But Ojiro narrowed his eyes in suspicion. Wait, something's not right. Before Ojiro could even finish his sentence, the door flew open, revealing a cascade of ice coming straight at him and Hagakure. None of them could scream or move before the ice completely froze them, the payload and the room. As they got trapped in the ice, both Ojiro and Hagakure tried to free themselves, to no avail. Ah, I can't move, Hagakure shouted. Ojiro tried to pull himself out of the ice, his tail trapped in a cold and sharp substance. Me neither. This ice is unbreakable, he grunted. If I were you, I wouldn't try moving unless you want to get frostbite. A new voice advised. That made Ojiro and Hagakure stop struggling. Both of them turned their heads to the door in fear. Through the icy mist, Todoroki walked into the room, looking rather calm. He simply walked past with ease due to the sudden lack of opposition, and all Ojiro and Hagakure could do was watch in shock. How did we lose? We weren't even given a chance, Ojiro finally whispered. As Todoroki touched the partly frozen payload, securing the win for his team, he glanced back at Ojiro dully. Simple. We just happened to be on different levels, Todoroki said smoothly. Everyone else, who was watching in the monitor room, stared at the screen in shock, including Shoji, who was standing outside the building. Once the period of shock was over, many people had mixed reactions. Some were terrified by the execution of the power of whatever quirk Todoroki had, and how well it seemed to work. Some were impressed by how quickly Todoroki neutralized the opposing team by himself. Most were just plain amazed at what they just witnessed. The girls were a mix of all of these things. As they stared at the monitor, Buttercup muttered one sentence. That was quick, she said. Blossom and Bubbles nodded in unison. Agreed. As All Might announced the winner of the match, that was when Todoroki used his left hand to send a pulse of heat through the building, which seemed to melt the ice easily. It had even warmed up the monitor room, which was somehow chilled by the cold of Todoroki's ice in a completely different building. As the class watched this, Blossom narrowed her eyes and murmured to herself. It looks like Todoroki has an ice quirk of some sort, but how can he heat up the room and melt the ice? To me, it looks like Todoroki can use both fire and ice as one singular power. Wow, that's cool, Buttercup whispered. And a bit scary. I hope none of us ever go up against him, Bubbles squeaked. Blossom nodded slowly. Yeah. Soon, the two teams came into the monitor room, and the class once again did their battle critique. But due to Todoroki incapacitating the other team and the battle ending so quickly, there wasn't much to critique on, so it ended quickly. But as soon as it did, All Might's phone pinged, and he glanced at it. After looking at it for a few moments, he smiled and put the phone away. Great, it's ready, he mumbled to himself. Even though he was mumbling to himself, Blossom heard it. What was he talking about? What was ready? But before she could speak, All Might spoke louder to the class. All right, everyone. Team K is up next. Momoko, Miyako, Kaoru, it's your time to fight. 2 battles in, the girls were called up for the third battle. The girls had no idea how it would work, with there being an uneven number of groups and the unfair advantage of being put against a team of 2. But apparently, All Might had a solution to this problem. Robots? Blossom asked. All Might nodded with his large grin. That's right, Momoko. Instead of students, you will be going up against a group of 3 robots. U.S. very own support department has agreed to design special robots on a moment's notice to fill in the role of being your opponent. Bubbles gulped. Won't it be hard, fighting a robot? Well, you did fight robots at the entrance exam, and not only did you manage well with them, but you also received 3 of the top scores. Don't worry. The robots are programmed to be a formidable opponent, but they won't give you a hard time. It will feel exactly like battling a fellow classmate. The girls still looked uneasy, which prompted All Might to add more to his advice. Trust me, girls. You all are very skilled and strong. You're the youngest people ever to be at UA High, and you're keeping up very well with the curriculum. I wish you the best in your battle trial. The three glanced at each other, then back at All Might before saying in unison, "Thanks." All Might nodded in approval. Good, good. Now, go on over to the test site. You have no time to waste. After hesitating for a moment, the girls finally left the room. Quickly, they exited the building and walked towards their battle site. Okay, the way I see this, it's a compliment, really. We're so strong that we need to fight robots instead of people, Blossom said, reassuring herself as much as her sisters. Buttercup pouted. I still wanted to go up against actual people. But hey, at least I can kick my opponent's face in without getting in trouble. Soon, the girls reached the building and stood outside. As they looked at it looming over them, Blossom frowned in determination. Here's the plan. Since we're fighting robots, I imagine they'll be like the ones at the entrance exam. Only, we have to be careful. The match is indoors, not outdoors, which means that we don't have that much space to work with. What we can do is simple. Bubbles, you can locate the payload. Buttercup and I can deal with the robots, while you go up there and get the payload, securing the win. Bubbles nodded. Okay, but I have a question. What if all of the robots decide to guard the payload? I'll be pitted against them all by myself. Easy. Bloss and I will come and back you up, Buttercup answered. But what if, in turn, all of the robots come after you guys? Well, that's pretty stupid of them if they do that. That just leaves the payload open for you. Yeah, I guess. But Bubbles, Blossom said, putting a supportive hand on her shoulder, we got this. If anything goes wrong, we capture the robots. That's easy enough, easier than getting to the payload. Either way, we'll get this win easily, I assure you. Bubbles looked at Blossom for a few seconds before grinning. All right, you're right, we can do this. Just then, the alarm sound echoed throughout the street, causing the girls to look forward with determined faces. Okay, girls, let's win this, Blossom declared as she raced inside. Yeah, Bubbles and Buttercup shouted in unison. Once the girls stepped inside, Bubbles stepped forward ahead of her sisters. As she closed her eyes, she used her supersonic voice to emit a high yet monotone sound, using echolocation to detect the payload. After a few seconds, she stopped and opened her eyes. The payload is on the 4th floor. 2 robots are making their way down here, but one is guarding the payload, Bubbles reported. Blossom smiled as the girls started to walk through the hallway. Perfect. That leaves a pretty even matchup. Bubbles, when we see the robots, you fly away to the payload. Roger, Bubbles chirped with a goofy salute. Just then, as they almost reached the corner, they heard a clicking sound, making them tense. What was that? Bubbles whispered, growing a little nervous. Buttercup moved forward slowly. I'll check it out. Her sisters didn't object, as Buttercup slowly slid along the wall to her left. As she reached the end of the wall, she stepped away from the wall and went around the corner. Bubbles and Buttercup were still, until they heard Buttercup talk. I don't see the robots. Suddenly, she was cut short by a loud thump. A split second afterwards, Buttercup screamed, prompting Bubbles and Blossom to rush around the corner. Buttercup, they gasped in unison. Buttercup was pinned to the ground on her stomach, struggling, and on top of her, holding her hand behind her back and restraining her, was a mechanical version of Blossom, with silver skin, bright red eyes, and even a steel bow and outfit to match. What the? Blossom whispered. Robot Blossom slowly turned its head to look at a shocked Blossom and Bubbles. As she looked at them, it narrowed its red eyes slowly. Suddenly, Buttercup's hand exploded with green fire, knocking Robot Blossom into a wall. In a flash, Buttercup pushed herself up, whirled around, and pinned the robot to the wall, her hands swirling with green fire. But then, another repeating clicking sound was heard, louder this time. Slowly, the girls looked up in horror to see another robot, this time a robot version of Buttercup, on the ceiling, its hands thrusted into the plaster and drywall. In a blink of an eye, Robot Buttercup dropped to the floor, grabbed Buttercup, and threw her aside into the arms of Bubbles and Blossom. As Robot Blossom got off the wall, the two stood side by side, looking at the girls with their creepy red eyes. "Buttercup, are you okay?" Blossom exclaimed. Buttercup stood up fully, glaring. "Gee, I don't know. I just got forced to the ground by a robotic version of you, and also got thrown by a robotic version of me. Other than that, I'm totally fine." Buttercup growled sarcastically. Suddenly Robot Blossom sprung towards Bubbles, prompting a scream out of the latter. But Blossom quickly intercepted the punch by catching it and kicked Robot Blossom, sending it flying down the hallway. "How did they even get down here so quickly? When I did the echolocation, they had just left the 4th floor," Bubbles gasped. "Then that means these guys are fast," Buttercup exclaimed. Blossom glared as the girls backed up a few steps from an approaching Robot Buttercup. "Either way, it doesn't matter. Buttercup, help me hold the robots off. Bubbles, do your thing." Bubbles gulped but obeyed as she dashed away in a blue light. As she blasted by Robot Blossom, the latter started to go after her before being hit by a red projectile. It was the Hyper Yo-Yo, and it went back to Blossom. "Hey, you gotta deal with us if you want her," she yelled. After that, Blossom flew over to her robot clone and grabbed it with her hands, dragging it with her around the corner. At the same time, Buttercup blocked an oncoming kick from Robot Buttercup, grabbed its foot, and rammed it into the wall. As Robot Buttercup tried to get up, Buttercup outstretched her right hand. Large amounts of green energy swirled around her hand until it formed into a golden hammer. "All right, you demon spawn. Make your choice. You can either surrender." When the hammer fully formed, Buttercup took it with both hands and banged it into the ground menacingly. "Or you can get your head caved in." Suddenly, Robot Buttercup lunged towards Buttercup, tackling her to the ground. As the hammer fell away from her hands with a clatter, Robot Buttercup aimed a punch towards Buttercup's head, before Buttercup landed a punch of her own on the robot's face, causing it to fly off of her. Buttercup then stood up and stretched out an open hand turned downwards. The hammer shook a little on the ground before flying up into her hand. "Okay, beating your ass it is," Buttercup growled. With a battle cry, Buttercup lunged at the robot, swinging the hammer. But with a simple swat, Robot Buttercup pushed it away and sprung with fists swinging. Quickly, Buttercup brought up the handle of the hammer, and the fists clanged against it. For a moment, Buttercup stood firm as Robot Buttercup threw punch after punch, each one deflecting harmlessly off the hammer handle. But after a few seconds, Buttercup threw a hard kick at the clone, prompting it to stumble back. When it did, Buttercup took her chance, readied her hammer, and swung hard. The mallet rammed into Robot Buttercup's side, causing her to not only fly into the wall, but to crash through it. As debris clouded the area, Buttercup neutralized her hammer and stepped slowly towards the crater. As she looked around inside of it, about to conclude that she had destroyed the robot, silver hands flew out of the dust and grabbed Buttercup's shirt. "Are you shitting me?" Before Buttercup could finish, the hands yanked her into the shadow, engaging the two in a second round of fighting. Elsewhere, on the 2nd floor, Blossom was busy dealing with Robot Blossom, who had dished out the following in its effort to wound Blossom: tracker missiles, laser eye beams, electricity attacks, and the ever-so-famous super strength. Currently, Blossom had just been pinned to the wall, while Robot Blossom kept her there with one hand and readied an electricity stun blast with the other. But before the stun blast could be charged, Blossom called up her own pink electricity through her hands and grabbed Robot Blossom's head. This caused an electric shock that temporarily paralyzed Robot Blossom, but allowed Blossom to throw it off of her and step back. Got to hand it to the techies in the support department. They really know how to make a robot a pain in the ass. Blossom panted as she tensed. Suddenly, Robot Blossom was on her, to Blossom's surprise, and tackled her to the ground. Blossom gathered her bearings quickly and punched the mechanical foe off of her. Before the robot could recover, Blossom went around it in a flash, forced its hand behind its back, and pushed it hard into the ground. Cracks in the concrete showed in the floor around Robot Blossom's face, but Blossom pushed harder. "Stand down. For my sake," Blossom growled. Of course, Robot Blossom didn't seem to care about Blossom one bit, as the hand behind its back started to heat up rapidly. Before Blossom knew it, a blast of fire caused her to be shot back several feet. But it didn't take long for her to get back up on her feet. Okay, you play with fire? Great, I'll play with ice. After she said that, Blossom took a very large and deep breath and exhaled forcefully, activating her ice breath. Like Todoroki's ice, the sub-zero solid spread through the hallway quickly, freezing Robot Blossom into a pristine block of ice. That should hold her, Blossom sighed as she let out a steamy puff of air. I guess I better go up to the payload and help Bubbles. Just then, Blossom's senses suddenly blared like a loud alarm, screaming at her to turn around. In a flash, Blossom jumped high into the air and did a backflip over Robot Buttercup, who would have punched Blossom in the back of her head if she hadn't moved. As she flew in the air, Blossom threw a pink energy blast at Robot Buttercup, which hit its mark and made it stumble. And there's another one. Wasn't Buttercup supposed to take care of you? Blossom groaned. Robot Buttercup didn't reply, as it turned around and lunged again, fighting Blossom and stalling her while the ice around Robot Blossom melted slowly. Meanwhile, Bubbles had finally reached the payload room. Quickly and quietly, Bubbles rushed to hide behind a pillar. Slowly, she bravely took a peek at the payload in front of her. And standing in front of the payload and guarding it like a security camera was Robot Bubbles. Okay, there's the robot me. Wow, I gotta say, I look adorable. But I have to focus. Maybe I could sneak around it or... Just then, a clicking sound was heard, coming from Robot Bubbles. It had suddenly straightened and left its spot. It seemed like it had detected Bubbles in the room and was stalking towards her hiding place. Crap, I think it knows I'm here. I should make a distraction and throw it off of my trail. Bubbles then realized that she had a perfect distraction. After clearing her throat softly, Bubbles spoke into her hands, clutched her hands, then threw it to another part of the room. This caused Bubbles' spoken words to echo from a completely different part of the room, instead of her voice coming from her spot. Hey, I'm over here, the voice shouted. As soon as it heard the voice, Robot Bubbles stopped and quickly turned around, marching to the corner. Quickly, Bubbles bolted from her hiding spot, flying to the payload. Come on, come. Suddenly, something large rammed into Bubbles' side, sending her off course. It was Robot Bubbles, and it had somehow anticipated Bubbles' rush to the payload, which meant that it had not been fooled by the distraction at all. Now, Robot Bubbles was on top of a fallen Bubbles, its balled fists in Bubbles' outstretched hands and inches away from Bubbles' face. Quickly, Bubbles pushed the robot off with a large amount of force. She then got up and sprinted towards the payload. But then, as she took a running dive for it, Robot Bubbles grabbed her foot, spun her around, and threw her into the ground. Oh! Bubbles squeaked from the newly made crater. Before Robot Bubbles could pin her down again, Bubbles was up in a flash, grabbing the robot by the shoulders and shoving it backwards into the floor behind it. But as she tried to attack again, Robot Bubbles punched Bubbles straight in the nose. A gasping cry came from Bubbles as she reeled back and held her throbbing nose. Robot Bubbles took its chance and kicked Bubbles to the floor. It wasn't finished as it landed a successful combo of punches on Bubbles, causing her to be forced farther into the ground. But as Robot Bubbles threw one final and powerful punch, Bubbles caught the fist. She dug her fingertips into the metal as she looked at the robot, looking rather annoyed. "You're getting on my nerves," she roared. Before the robot knew it, it was being blasted by a very powerful energy blast, propelling it into the ceiling. Forgetting the payload, Bubbles flew up to the ceiling, grabbed the robot, and threw it into the floor hard. Robot Bubbles didn't even get a chance to catch a break, as Bubbles unleashed her own combo of punches. "You know, for someone cute, you sure aren't nice. Hope this whooping put some sense into that computer brain of yours." As this happened, down below on the second floor, Blossom was now fighting two robots, Robot Buttercup and Robot Blossom, who was able to release itself from the ice prison. Suddenly, as Robot Buttercup ready to punch, Buttercup skidded into view. She looked similar to how she did at the entrance exam, ruffled and a tiny bit dazed yet absolutely furious. Only, Buttercup looked even angrier this time around, as she flew to Robot Buttercup, heaved it into the air, and slammed it into the floor. While the ground merely cracked the other times the robots were pushed to the floor, this time, the floor completely gave way, making Robot Buttercup fall all the way to the first floor. I'm not done with you, Peach, Buttercup hollered as she flew down the hole in a green flash. Blossom seemed to pay no mind to this, as she tackled Robot Blossom to the ground. As each of the three girls pinned their robotic selves down, each one of them had colored energy surging around their bodies, as they looked down furiously at their opponent and swung a fist at their faces. Krah! When the punch hit its mark, explosions seemed to form in slow motion. Blooms of fire and light enveloped the girls, as their faces changed from anger to shock. The building groaned from the pressure of the explosions before it had finally given out. The windows shattered, the walls crumbled, and the floors fell apart. And then, just like that, time was normal again. The girls were now laying on the ground, next to what was left of the robots' decimated corpses, and in what was left of the building that nearly got blasted to the ground. Just then, All Might's voice spoke through the loudspeaker. The match is now over. The team of robots win, due to Team K's disqualification because of excessive combat leading to the robot's fatality. Blossom looked up at the blue sky, slowly registering what All Might had said. But when it clicked, she was shocked. Excessive combat? What the hell is he talking about? But then, Blossom saw her robot clone laying next to her, now a mangled jumble of scrap metal. She remembered that punch she gave it, even though she didn't remember the punch being so strong. They had essentially killed the robots, which meant they had basically killed villains. And a hero must never ever kill a villain, unless having extreme cause to do so. Blossom felt sick to her stomach as she looked back up at the sky. When she had watched Bakugou's battle, she had been appalled by Bakugou's apparent lunacy when he blasted part of the building apart. And yet, here she and her sisters were, laying in the ruins of a majorly destroyed building. As Blossom laid there, she came to a frightening realization. Bakugou's not the ticking time bomb we are. After the battle trial fiasco, the girls didn't really know how to feel at first. Dazed was a good word to describe their feelings, especially when they walked back into the monitor room and joined the rest of their class. But as the class went through the battle critique, the girls found that dazed wasn't an accurate word to describe their current feelings. No, a better word would be stupefied. At first, the girls had no idea what they did to fail, even with Blossom having a notion of their mistakes. But as they watched students raising their hands and as they listened to their provided commentary, there was a theme among all of the constructive criticism. And that was the fact that the girls had killed the villains in their rage. To be fair, the girls, at least in their opinion, shouldn't have been to blame for the robot's demise. How were they supposed to know that a punch that was only meant to disable would end up being much more destructive? Sure, the potency of the punch was the ultimate error that cost them the win. That was a result of their powers though, not them. The girls never intended to hurt the robots. Well, maybe a little. But not kill. Certainly not kill. They're not savages. But of course, it wasn't depicted that way when it came time for the battle critique. The good news was that the class's reaction to their power was much more positive than the class's reaction to their irrational thinking. The girls couldn't go 1 second throughout the rest of the battle trial exercise without getting a compliment from a classmate. The bad or maybe good news was that every match that came after that went smoothly. While that was a good thing, due to nobody getting hurt and buildings not getting knocked down like toothpicks, it made things a little boring. Not a lot, but a little. But before the girls knew it, class was over and therefore, the school day was finished. Everyone had to change out of their hero costumes to Bubbles' dismay, as she was planning to wear it forever and head back to the classroom to grab their things. As Blossom stopped by her desk and gathered her stuff, she did it absent-mindedly. That was because she was thinking about the girls' failure at the battle trial. What if she and her sisters had done things differently? What if, instead of taking on the robot, Blossom and Buttercup simply ditched them to go and get the payload with Bubbles? If they were determined enough, the three girls could have easily outrun the robots, flown to the payload, and secured it with a simple touch. They could have easily just thrown the robots out the window, buying them time to get to the payload. Honestly, there were a lot of smarter strategies the girls could have gone with instead to win. Buttercup was thinking about the battle trial too. Only, she was more bothered about their loss rather than the topic of strategy. "We should have won. I don't care what All Might says," Buttercup growled as she threw her books into her backpack angrily. "I mean, it's not like he told us that destroying the robots would get us disqualified. Plus, I don't want to hear any of that fighting a robot equals fighting a classmate nonsense. I'm telling you, if we didn't beat up those killer machines, they'd be the ones killing us. I bet if we had fought real people instead, they wouldn't have tried to strangle the life out of us. Instead of disagreeing with Buttercup, Bubbles surprisingly nodded. Exactly. My robot opponent punched me in the nose. Hard. Like, that really hurts. Still hurts now. Blossom came over to the two, her backpack slung over her shoulder, frowning at them. Guys, we've literally dealt with opponents like this back in Townsville. Mojo Jojo, him, Princess. All those guys, they've given us plenty of bruises and injuries. Yeah, so, what's your point? Buttercup scoffed. My point is that while they do hurt us, we end up easily stopping them. We rarely lose our temper in fights. But look at us now. The robots we fought today are more or less like our villains. But guess what? We end up destroying a building all because we punched them in the face a little too hard. Wanna know why that is? Bubbles clutched onto her stuffy and lowered her head, ashamed. Because we lost our temper. Exactly. That's the real reason we lost. We went overboard. Blossom sighed. Buttercup still looked angry as she rolled her eyes. Well, according to the hotshots here, every single thing we do is doing too much. So, the real reason we lost isn't because we went overboard, but because All Might thought we went overboard. Because apparently we're too much for anybody to handle. Blossom shook her head slightly. While I can't deny that sometimes our actions are justified, you do realize that the hotshots have a point. All these years of crime fighting has gotten to our heads. We're obviously more mature than when we were 5, but that still doesn't stop us from making mistakes, like going off the rails. As much as we try to deny it, we need to learn a thing or two when it comes to fighting crime, like keeping our tempers in check. Do you agree with me? Bubbles and Buttercup hesitated for a few seconds. Finally, they slowly nodded. Yeah, I guess, Buttercup groaned. Still think that the decision's bullshit though. It was around that time that the girls had realized that they were the only ones left in the classroom. Everyone else had left already. Okay, it's about time we get home. Bubbles, you wanted to make katsudon for dinner, right? Bubbles immediately brightened, and she nodded. She was the unofficial chef for mealtimes at the new Powerpuff household. Yeah, got the recipe and everything. Trust me, it's gonna be the best thing you've ever tasted. As the girls walked out of the classroom and down the hallway to the exit, a sudden voice shouted behind them, making them jump. Hold on, girls. The three whirled around to see All Might rushing towards them, as they all sighed in both relief and annoyance. He's about to give me a damn heart attack with his shouts, I swear. Buttercup muttered under her breath. As All Might reached them, he stopped with a sheepish chuckle. Sorry to startle you, but I was hoping to catch you before you go. I'd like to have a little chat with you before you head home. None of the girls were expecting this. A talk with All Might? Alone? That could only mean one thing. Does he know their secret? All Might noticed their scared expressions and smiled. Oh, you're not in trouble or anything, in case you were wondering. I just want to address a few things. Is that okay? The word that they really wanted to answer with was simple. No. But then again, you can't exactly say no to an authority figure who wants to talk to you, unless you want them to become even more suspicious than they already are. So, even though the girls wanted nothing more than the chance to bolt out of the school doors, they said the answer that All Might wanted to hear. That's okay. Before they knew it, the girls were in the classroom once more. Being at school after hours felt strange. There was no lively chatter from students or the constant sounds of shoes tapping against the smooth floor as people walked to classes. Instead, the only sounds present were a few awkward coughs and the sound of the girls rustling in their seats, trying to get comfortable. But the awkward silence didn't last long, as All Might finally said something. I've been meaning to pull you girls aside for a while. Ever since school started, actually, I feel like we've never really gotten the chance to talk to one another. Even when I saved you from the sludge villain way back when. This is the talk that I want to have with you. The three nodded, but looked slightly confused. What exactly do you want to talk to us about, though? Blossom asked. A number of things. The main one is about your current circumstances. What I mean by that is that you girls are by far the most unique students UA has had. not just in class 1 but in the whole school. The average first-year UA student is 15 years old. But you girls are 12. That's a big accomplishment, being so young and yet so powerful that you can keep up with your older classmates. The girls blinked. They hadn't been expecting this talk to start off with All Might complimenting them. "Thank you, sir," Bubbles said, speaking for both of her sisters. "Not a problem. I do commend you for being much more skilled than most kids in your age group. But I am also a bit cautious. It is a good thing that you are studying to be heroes early on. But you are still kids. Yes, you have a powerful quirk and amazing abilities. But that doesn't mean you're immune to making irrational decisions. You have a long way to go when it comes to strategizing in hero battles, and I wish to help you with that. Understand?" They couldn't believe it. Instead of interrogating them, All Might wanted to talk to the girls because he wants to look out for them. When it's put like that, the girls felt a little guilty for assuming that All Might simply wanted to press some answers out of them to explain why their quirks were so strong or why they were so unfamiliar to society's hero restrictions. But All Might wasn't done with his talk. "Speaking of your quirk, I just wanted to mention something about them. You see, UA keeps files on student quirks for every student in the whole school. According to your files, your quirks are so far labeled TBD. TBD? Bubbles asked. To be determined. Blossom explained, her voice a little jittery from nerves. All Might nodded. Yes, that's right. UA hasn't been able to quite place what your quirks are or what you can do with them. You yourself don't know that much about your quirks either, I'm assuming. The girls hesitated. Then Blossom replied, no. That, believe it or not, wasn't a lie. It was the whole truth. Sure, the girls knew that their super abilities weren't quirks, and they also knew how to control them enough to fight enemies. But they didn't know what exactly their powers were. All they knew about their powers was that they had appeared when they were 5. And thanks to the professor and his extensive research, the girls also knew that their powers were the result of a mutated component in their DNA, a mystical property that was named Chemical X. As far as the girls knew, their powers were simply a very strange freak of nature, but they often wondered how they became the lucky ones that ended up with that freaky ability in the first place. Perhaps this is one of those mysteries the girls just needed to admit was unsolved. All Might nodded. I figured. Which is why you're not only going to be learning about being a hero, you're going to be learning more and more about your quirks. I promise you, by the end of the school year, I'll make sure that we know just what exactly your quirks are. When they heard this, the girls froze. All Might had just promised to basically discover and unveil the girls' big secret. While he did not say that outright, and while it seems like finding out the girls' secret isn't his intention, trying to find out what their quirks are could lead him to that discovery. Either way, when it comes down to it, he was eventually going to find out that they were not from this world. Before the girls could dwell on it, All Might clapped his hands together. Okay, that's all I want to say. You girls can go home now. I'll see you tomorrow. And with that, All Might got up and left the classroom, leaving the girls sitting there with shock and a lot of racing thoughts. Do you think he knows? Bubbles finally squeaked. Buttercup shook her head slightly while frowning. Nah, he doesn't think we're girls from another dimension. He just thinks we're girls with freakish quirks. Bubbles sighed. You know, I'm a little sick of keeping up the ruse we're from here. Can't we just tell All Might the truth? Blossom sighed. She was thinking the exact same thing. Would it really be that bad if they told All Might who they were and where they came from? He was the #1 hero. Out of all the people in this reality, All Might seems like the person you'd least expect to exploit the girls and their true power once he figures out who they are. And yet, Blossom couldn't shake that warning Aizawa gave the girls just before their UA entrance exam. There are bad people here, people that will want to know more about how and why you came here, along with what exactly you are. And they will do bad things to get that information. You can only tell the truth to people you can trust. So far, the girls have found nobody they could trust. Frankly, the only people the girls trusted were Nezu and Aizawa. And even then, they didn't trust the two completely. Sure, they had new friends in their class, and they might be people who could be trusted. But the girls have only known them for 2 days. They needed more time to think on that matter. So, as nice and caring All Might seemed, The girls couldn't trust him with their secret. Not yet. And so, Blossom told her sisters that. When she did, Bubbles and Buttercup agreed with her. I guess it's settled then. We're not telling anybody anything until the time is right, Buttercup said. Exactly, Blossom replied with a nod. For a few seconds, the girls sat there until Bubbles suddenly broke the silence with a yawn, prompting Blossom to stand up. All right? We've been here long enough. Unless we're planning to sleep over here for the night, we gotta go and catch the train ride home. Buttercup groaned. Aw man, can't we just fly this once? Please, Blossom. I am tired of being squished next to people in a stuffy train. Yeah, me too. Bubbles agreed. Plus, I ran out of lock-eye bracelets to pass out to people. Blossom looked out the window at the sky. The sun was already setting. Well, since it's getting dark and the train takes too long, we might as well. But when we fly, we stick together and don't take detours. Blossom's last sentence more or less fell on deaf ears, as Bubbles and Buttercup shouted, "Yeah!" In a flash, the two flew out of the door in a blue and green blur. Quickly, Blossom blasted after them, her own pink trail being left behind her. Soon, the girls were bouncing through the hallways, out the door, and up into the air. As Yua became a tiny building on the ground, the girls blasted away, looking like 3 colorful shooting stars to the people down below. Little did they know, someone was watching their colored trails illuminating the sky, hiding in the shadows as they watched. Think you can just forget me, huh? Well, my little girls, you won't forget me for long. The next few days at school passed by like a blur. The girls seemed to be finally adjusting to their new lives, achieving a balance between their 2 lives. One was obviously hero training, as they put on their costumes time and time again to compete in exercises meant to help hone their talents. The other was their social life. In their class, the girls were starting to establish their friendship circles. They began to sit with other people at lunch, talk with them between and before classes, and even walk to the train station with them at the end of each school day. The girls were becoming more popular in class one a day after day, and they now knew everyone's names. The girls did often find themselves in humorous situations. One example of that is when Blossom ran for the spot of class representative. Despite her confidence that her newfound popularity was going to secure the spot for her, she ended up losing. To Blossom's dread and to Buttercup's amusement, the latter wouldn't stop bringing up the story for weeks to come, often recounting it with a lot of laughter and cackling. While she was salty about it for the next few days, Blossom did come to respect the decision. Especially when the former president, Izuku, stepped down and put Ida as a class president. When Ida had calmed down half of the school in the time where persistent news reporters were mistaken for villains intruding Yua. Speaking of the media, the girls had their fair share of encounters with them, the majority of them not at all pleasant. Apparently, All Might was right. The girls being the youngest students at UA, the youngest students in UA history, was a big deal. So big that literally every Japanese news channel mentioned them at least once. The public's opinion of the girls varied. Most resented the idea of them going to UA, saying that little girls belong in middle schools, not the #1 Hero Academy in Japan. Some worried for the girls' safety, as UA was a dangerous place that was not for the faint of heart. And only a few had no problems with the girls being at UA, wishing to see them grow into young heroes. Regardless of whatever the public thought of them, it was clear that the Powerpuff Girls were very well known, even in a reality not of their own, which resulted in others focusing their interest on them, not just the good, but the bad people too. However, the girls themselves did not know this. Not until their first school field trip to USTS. "Let's do this, beaches," Buttercup whooped, doing a fist pump. The 3 girls were currently on the school bus with the rest of Class 1A on their way to the training facility known as the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, UST for short. Bubbles, who was sitting next to Buttercup, bounced up and down in her chair, her pigtails swishing with the movement. "I'm so excited, it's our first field trip," she squealed. Blossom, who sat on the other side of Buttercup, leaned over to look at Bubbles. "It's not necessarily a field trip. It's more like an off-campus class. This isn't your typical museum sightseeing type of thing. It is an educational learning experience about rescue and—" "Oh my God," Buttercup groaned. "Could you at least wait a few minutes before killing the mood?" In another seat, Ida overheard the conversation and spoke up. Momoko is correct. This is not your average field trip. We can all come from this learning experience with a valuable lesson, he said for the whole class to hear. I already learned a lesson. Don't take educational buzzkills on field trips. Buttercup mumbled under her breath. Meanwhile, the other students on the bus were talking about quirks. You know, Midoriya. Tsuyu, the frog girl, pointed out, your quirk is kinda similar to All Might's. Ribbit. After hearing this, Izuku's face immediately went red, getting completely flustered in a matter of seconds. I guess so. Haha. It's probably a coincidence though, right? Izuku stammered nervously, trying to look like he was nonchalant about the suggestion. Yeah, it could be. But still, you and All Might really are similar in terms of quirks. Tsuyu replied. Next to her, Kirishima shook his head. I don't think so. I mean, All Might doesn't break his bones when using his quirk. I have to admit though, it's a really cool quirk. I wish I had a quirk as flashy as that. What are you talking about, Kirishima? Bubbles piped up. Your quirk's super cool. Yeah, Izuku agreed. Your quirk is also quite useful. A great asset for a hero. Kirishima smiled at the compliments. Thanks, but I'd still love to have a flashy quirk. Take Bakugou for an example. He can create explosions. That would be a great power for a hero to have. Bakugou's too angry to be a hero, Tsuyu said bluntly. As the conversation went on, Bakugou was just sitting in his chair and staring out of the window. But once Tsuyu said that, his eyes snapped towards her, flaring up. What did you say? What is that supposed to mean? He shouted. In his seat, Denki shrugged. She means that your personality needs some work. A lot of work. Yeah, you can't save people and be popular if all you do is shout at people. Ribbit. Tsuyu noted. Why you? Shut it. Frogface, I don't shout at people, Bakugou shouted. Buttercup scoffed. Says a guy who's currently shouting. Blossom pushed Buttercup softly. Kaoru. I'm just saying, he's proving their point, she said a little too smugly. Bakugou turned to look at Buttercup, seething. That's rich coming from the girl whose only personality is shouting, he accused. Buttercup's eyes widened in rage as she stood up. Oh, I know you're not talking. As the class watched them, some of them were saying, fight, fight, while Blossom sighed in disappointment and Bubbles looked panicked. But before the two could get into a full-on brawl on the bus, that was when Aizawa had finally turned to face the class, face calm but eyes filled with barely contained fury. Is there a problem, Kaoru and Bakugou? Because if there is, I'd be more than happy to handle it. Aizawa snapped. Bakugou and Buttercup looked at Aizawa then at each other. Although the two were hotheads, they still knew better than to mess with a teacher like Aizawa. So even though they threw daggered glares at each other, they both sat down and mumbled, No sir. Other than that incident, nothing interesting happened until the bus reached its destination. As the class came out of the bus, they then followed their teacher into the dome-shaped building. Once they were inside, the class got to see what exactly was in store for them inside the USJ. And judging from everyone's awestruck expressions, USJ did not disappoint. The inside of the USJ was a combination of different simulated terrains. There was a water-based area, an area with burning buildings, and a rocky and dusty area, to name a few. The whole place was massive, way bigger than the outside of the USJ let on, and it was all for Class 1 today. As the girls looked around, Buttercup was freaking out. Oh my god, look at this beauty. This is amazing. I feel like I'm in an amusement park, Bubbles exclaimed as she hopped up and down. We might as well be, Blossom noted, clearly impressed as she looked around. Truly a marvel, I must say. As Class 1 fawned over the USJ though, one person finally caught their attention. I see our visitors have finally arrived, a perky voice declared. The voice belonged to what looked like a hero decked out in an astronaut-esque outfit. And as soon as Blossom laid her eyes on her, her eyes grew wide and her jaw dropped. That's 13, she sputtered. Who now? Bubbles and Buttercup asked in unison. 13, she's a pro hero and the best rescue hero there is. Her quirk is called Black Hole, which allows her to create a destructive vacuum that can destroy almost anything. She's amazing. I have to get her autograph, Blossom squealed. Buttercup raised an eyebrow. I think we need to get you off of your HeroWiki binges if you know all of this stuff. Before the girls could talk more, 13 spoke again to the class, who started to quiet down. Hi there, welcome to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. Now, some of you may know me, but for those who don't, I'm 13, the Black Hole Hero. I'm excited to be working with you today. After she said that, Class 1A clapped. Blossom clapped a little too enthusiastically. Let me start this introduction off by saying what exactly the UST is meant for. You see, this whole place has vastly different areas, providing various situations that heroes might find themselves in when doing their job. These simulations are meant to train you in not the field of fighting, but rescue. In my mind, being a pro hero doesn't mean you get to beat up villains or chase after popularity all day. It's about being a person that's needed, a symbol that everyone looks up to. People need heroes all around the world. And while you're not at a point where you have the ability to travel the world, it's best that you prepare for that occasion. Why? Because it's important to be someone people can depend on. And when I say heroes, I mean everyone. Even those who have not so special quirks. I personally don't care for flashy and dangerous quirks, simply because quirks that can help and rescue mean and matter much more. So, keep this in mind when I say this. Your powers are not meant to inflict harm. When we're done with all of this, I hope that you leave here today with the understanding that you're meant to help people. Once she finished, 13 received a loud and passionate applause from Class 1A. As the girls clapped, they took in the advice with wonder. Rescue definitely wasn't something new for them to learn, but they did see it in a new light. Before, they haven't really thought of hero work that way. Sure, their priority is to save people. But for so long, they believed that simply chasing away the bad guy would do the trick. As the girls grew, they seemed to have lost sight of what true rescuing was all about. And 13's speech more than reminded them of that. Perhaps this is what going to UA was all about. Seeing things in a new way. But the retrospective and happy moment ended quickly. Suddenly, a blast of purple energy appeared on the battlefield down below, prompting everyone to look that way. It was a small thing that rapidly expanded, shrouding a good part of the barren ground in purple smoke. The scariest thing about the whole thing wasn't the purple fog. In fact, the scariest thing was the event in which numerous distorted figures emerged from it. Immediately, everyone's confusion turned into worry and fear as they stepped back. The girls stepped back too, looking at the figures with bewilderment. They clearly didn't look friendly, some looked cruel, some looked malicious, and nearly all of them looked downright barbaric. The scariest of them emerged last. One of them was a man with light blue hair and strange and eerily lifelike hands swarming his body and face. The other one looked unrecognizable, since they wore a long coat with the hood covering their weirdly big head. Once they left the fog seemed to contract, shapeshifting into what looked like a ghostly version of a person. Instantly, everyone knew who these new visitors were. Villains. Down on the main grounds, the blue one peered at the group of terrified students and shocked teachers, looking for someone. But after looking for a few seconds, he frowned. "Kurogiri," he said in a harsh and raspy voice, "where's All Might?" The black fog's yellow eyes darted up to look at what the man with blue hair was previously looking at. Then, he slowly frowned. "He doesn't seem to be here, Tamura," he answered. The man, or Tamura as Kurogiri called him, flared. "Damn it, why?" "I do not know. The UA curriculum plan did say that he would be here with the students," Kurogiri replied. As they listened in on the conversation from the top of the front steps, Aizawa realized something. "They were the ones who broke into UA," he whispered. Once they heard that, the class freaked out, including the girls. "Broke in? They stalked us here. Oh man, I'm scared." The girls looked distressed and confused. When have the villains ever broken into UA? But then, they remembered yesterday. That day, there was commotion going on because of a few nosy reporters accidentally tipping off the security system. The pandemonium of panicked students was a perfect distraction for someone if they wanted to slip into UA undetected. Maybe that was how the villains were able to get their hands on the Class 1A lesson plan. This was bad. Very bad. What do villains want with them? It seems to be All Might, as they talked about why he wasn't here. At that moment, nearly everyone was glad that All Might had decided to hold off going on the field trip at the last minute to do something. That is, until Tamura spoke again. Well then, if that bastard isn't here, we need to draw him out. A few dead kids here and there will do the trick. He mused rather casually. After they registered that, all of Class 1 panicked. They're gonna kill us? Bubbles screamed. Oh hell no, I'm not going down by the hands of good-for-nothing villains, Buttercup growled in indignation. Blossom nodded in agreement with Buttercup, her eyes sparkling with barely contained fury. Just then, Aizawa said something that shocked the class. 13. I need you to evacuate the students. They need to get back to UA as soon as possible, he told the pro hero. 13 looked uneasy and on edge. But what about you? I'll hold off the villains and make sure that they don't get close, Aizawa replied. At those words, Class 1 looked at their teacher with shock and panic. You can't do that, Bubbles exclaimed. It's you against hundreds of them. Miyako's right. You can get hurt, and the odds of battle aren't in your favor, Izuku added. Aizawa looked at the class, his eyes sympathetic yet determined. Don't worry about me. I can handle them. Worry about yourselves and getting back to UA. I'll follow when these guys are taken care of. Before the class could protest, Aizawa took off, zooming down the stairs and into the central plaza. Mr. Aizawa, Bubbles gasped. As she said that, she tried to go after him, but Blossom quickly held her back. He's right, Bubbles, she mumbled to her panicked sister. He's a pro hero. He can take care of this. While the thought didn't completely placate Bubbles, she did step back, ditching her plan to jump in after him. I hope that's true, she whispered, wide-eyed with worry. But as Aizawa took on the villains, it looked like that was true. Villains fell and wiped out left and right as Aizawa fought each one that came at him while canceling out their dangerous quirks before they could do damage. After a few seconds, 13 finally rounded up the class and pushed them towards the exit. Come on, guys. Leave safely and carefully to the exit. Suddenly, she was cut short by a deafening whoosh that caused everyone to cover their ears. In front of them, a purple dot of dark energy appeared in thin air, growing rapidly. The class and 13 stepped back fearfully, as the fog materialized into Kurogiri, and with him was the strange hooded figure, who stepped out of the fog. As Kurogiri formed into his human form, he narrowed his bright yellow eyes. Stand down, heroes. No one's going anywhere, he said calmly yet menacingly. Shaking with rage, Buttercup pushed to the front of the crowd before Bubbles or Blossom could stop her. You? Who are you people? What do you want with us? Buttercup demanded. As soon as she finished, the hooded person turned their head to look straight at her. Even though their face was covered in shadow, it appeared that they looked intrigued, almost eager, to see the Powerpuff standing before them. Simple, Kurogiri replied. We're the League of Villains, and we're here to kill All Might. Almost all of Class 1 knew what the villain's motive was, but hearing Kurogiri confirm it shocked them severely. After all, knowing that there were people out there wanting to murder the symbol of peace, and knowing that those very people were right in front of them was very frightening. After a few passing seconds, 13 stood protectively in front of the class. When she spoke, her voice was filled with barely contained anger. You'll never get the chance, and neither will you get the chance to kill these students. My priority is to protect, so if you want them, you'll have to go through me, 13 shouted. Kurogiri and the hooded person exchanged glances. Then, instead of Kurogiri replying, the hooded person spoke. Do we? How amusing. While I admit you are a capable pro-hero, that's all I'm willing to give you. We can easily handle you, along with these little kids, and we'll make sure that each and every one of you will regret ever messing with us. As they heard the speech, the class was petrified in fear and indignation. But at that moment, two people decided to take action. Suddenly, Kirishima and Bakugou both tore from the crowd, aiming attacks at Kurogiri, who was the most exposed. But Kurogiri easily forced them back with a wave of fog. As they landed on the ground on their feet, Kurogiri seemed to grow in size, looming over the terrified class. But as he doubled his size, Blossom noticed that both him and the hooded figure who was looking at Kirishima and Bakugou were distracted. That was why she tore from the crowd as well. In a blur of pink, Blossom flew over her classmates and stopped right in front of Kurogiri. Quickly, she inhaled a bunch of air then exhaled, blasting her icy mist all over Kurogiri. Soon, he was trapped in a large block of ice. As Blossom floated in the air, she saw the hooded figure turn to look at her. Then, he uttered a word that only the two of them could hear. Blossom. Immediately after she registered the word, Blossom stilled, wide-eyed. Thousands of thoughts rushed through her head, until she found herself thinking one terrifying thought. He knows who I am. Before Blossom could react, however, there was a large boom, and ice suddenly went flying everywhere. As panicked students took cover, Blossom turned to see that Kurogiri had busted free of his ice prison, and was now growing to an incredibly large size. Dark purple fog overtook her and the class. Once it did, Blossom could feel herself being shot back unbelievably fast, and she tumbled blindly into the darkness. As quickly as the darkness came over Blossom, it disappeared around her, revealing open sky. Down below her were a bunch of debris from broken buildings and structures. With a start, Blossom realized that she was now in the ruins zone, one of the simulated landscapes in the USD. Sadly, that was all Blossom could think of before she started free falling. The air quickly turned into a ferocious wind as she fell, tossing around her hair, bow, and costume. As Blossom fell, though, something caught her eye. A girl in blue and a girl in green, falling through the air while unconscious. Once she laid her eyes on them, memories from the past 10 minutes hit her like a tidal wave. Villains kill all might kill us, Blossom. In a blink of an eye, Blossom stopped falling, activating her flight a few miles up from the ground. Quickly, she swooped down to her sisters as they still fell. "Bubbles! Buttercup! Wake up!" Blossom shouted urgently. As soon as they heard her voice, Bubbles' eyes and Buttercup's eyes flew open in unison. Immediately after they did, they activated their flight and stopped falling. Blossom then slowed down, incredibly relieved. That was close. Slowly, Bubbles and Buttercup flew up to her, confused. "Blossom? What's going on?" Bubbles asked. "Yeah, what happened?" Buttercup added, glaring. "And where's that glorified smoke monster so that I can beat him up?" Blossom took another look around. Now that she wasn't falling, she could see her surroundings clearly. Her assumption was correct. They were still at the USD in the ruins zone. As she looked around, she replied, "I don't know, but I think that the smoke villain brought us here," she said. Bubbles and Buttercup looked bewildered. "How?" "It appears that he has the power to teleport," Blossom explained. "Not just himself, but other people. He brought the villains over here to the USD, and he was able to teleport from the central plaza to the exit. And when he swarmed us with smoke, I think that he teleported us away from the exit." Bubbles and Buttercup looked at each other, then at Blossom. "That makes sense," Buttercup replied. "But if that's true, then where are the others?" Bubbles asked. Blossom narrowed her eyes as she looked at the central plaza. "That's what I'm worried about. When the smoke villain warped us, I think he scattered the class in different places. He split us up." Buttercup and Bubbles looked in the direction of Blossom's gaze, both frowning in determination. "Then, that means we gotta find them," Buttercup declared. Blossom was about to agree when something caught her eye. A weird spherical projectile was flying their way. As it got close, Blossom's eyes widened as she suddenly whirled around to her sisters. "Get down." But it was too late. As the projectile flew in between them, an explosion was emitted from it, sending the girls flying backwards. Each of the girls were shot into nearby buildings, nearly breaking the already worn walls. It didn't take long for them to recover, and they blasted away from the building. "What was that?" Buttercup yelled, riled up. "A bomb," Blossom replied, just as angry. "I bet someone threw it." As she looked around, it didn't take long for Bubbles to find the culprit. "You mean him?" she asked, pointing. Blossom and Buttercup turned around to see someone standing on the roof of a barely standing building. It was the hooded figure, the one with Kurogiri. At this point, his cloak was moving around, revealing an intimidating outfit of armor. In his hands were more of the weirdly shaped bombs, and plenty of them were attached to the belt on his waist. Before the girls could react, the person threw 3 more bombs, one towards Blossom, one towards Bubbles, and one towards Buttercup. The girls didn't waste a single word as they took action, determined to deflect the bombs. Blossom summoned her hyper yo-yo and used it to grab the bomb. In one singular motion, Blossom threw the bomb towards a nearby building, and the bomb decimated that instead. Bubbles manipulated bright blue energy to create an energy-constructed bubble and threw it at the bomb. The bubble then engulfed the bomb, so when the bomb exploded, it was contained in the small bubble that simply popped harmlessly afterwards. Buttercup simply caught the bomb with her bare hands, then turned around, flinging the bomb like a ball. The bomb was then blasted into a building, taking down the building and a couple around it with its explosion. Once all of the bombs were neutralized, the person took off, jumping from one roof to another in an attempt to get away. But the girls were quick, and they flew over to the person. Buttercup used her green fire to throw a fireball at the person, which he dodged easily. But when he dodged, he ended up landing on the edge of the roof, causing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground below. Although he lost his balance before, the person was more than prepared for surviving falls and easily landed on his own 2 feet. A few feet in front of him, the Powerpuff Girls landed, clearly aggravated and battle-ready. "You're in for a rough time, buddy. You'll regret messing with us," Buttercup hollered as she and her sisters got into fighting positions. The hooded person was quiet for a few seconds, but then, to the girls' surprise, he started laughing. Now, girls, don't be rude," he said between chuckles. Simultaneously, the girls' eyes widened. Before, when the hooded person spoke to them and their class, the girls were too focused on the looming threat and their wild feelings of fear and panic. But standing right here, right now, and hearing the person's chuckles and words, the girls finally noticed something that they failed to notice before. He sounded familiar. Slowly, the person reached his gloved hands up to his head and grabbed the hood. And as he lowered the hood to show his face, the girls' suspicions were confirmed. "No way," Buttercup whispered. "Is that?" Bubbles gasped. As the person smiled a wicked grin at them and let go of his hood, Blossom finally said his name. "Mojo Jojo." "Long time, no see, girls. I've missed you." The girls stared dumbfounded at Mojo Jojo, who was clearly amused by their confusion. None of them could find anything to say. That was because they were in a state of complete shock. After all, anybody would be shocked at seeing their worst enemy, who they presumed to be Mia or even dead for a long time, standing right in front of them. Finally, one of them responded, that person being Buttercup. "What the F?" she yelled. Normally, both Blossom and Bubbles would have scolded Buttercup for cursing, but they couldn't really do that when they were thinking the exact thing. Mojo frowned, his smile still on his face. That's a weird way to say nice to see you aren't dead, Mojo." Blossom glared. Why are you here, Mojo Jojo? Better question, how are you here?" "Yeah, and how are you not dead?" Bubbles added. Mojo's eyes glinted with malice as his smile faded into a sneer. "I can ask you girls the same thing." Before the girls could reply, Mojo spoke again as he started to pace slowly. "I have to say, girls, I'm hurt. Not once in all of these months, while you were gallivanting around doing God knows what, going to high schools and having the time of your lives, did you ever stop to wonder how I was doing? How I managed to scrape by this gruesome year. I've done things that I'd never thought I'd be doing, seen things that I should have never seen. Not to mention I was kidnapped more times than I cared to admit." Mojo stopped walking suddenly, his eyes growing angrier. "Like, for instance, did you know that when I came here, I had to spend 6 months in jail? Just because I conveniently crash-landed into a building when I fell from the sky. I was charged with destruction of private property, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault on my first day. And don't even get me started on how I found out you girls were here. It was through a news report airing on some shitty jail TV, and they were talking all about the Wonder Girls who had fascinating quirks that no one has ever seen before. They talked about you for days, glorifying and praising your skills, while I rotted away in a jail cell, not hearing one mention of the great Mojo Jojo. Do you know how terrible that feels?" The girls were quiet, staring at Mojo. They didn't know how to feel. Angry, guilty, and annoyed seemed like the best emotions to describe what they were feeling. Obviously, they didn't like Mojo Jojo, considering the countless times they clashed and fought. But seeing their arch-nemesis recounting the days he spent alone and confused sparked a feeling of what could only be described as pity inside of them. That is, until Mojo talked again. The only reason I was able to become free was when strange villains busted in my prison and freed virtually every villain there, including myself. They gathered us all together because they wanted us to join their army to take down All Might. And, believe it or not, they specifically wanted me. Me. Apparently, they found out what a great scientist I am, and they wanted me to modify their monsters. But, do you know what the best part of it was? They promised me my chance of revenge. Which is why, girls. Mojo then grinned evilly as he took out multiple bombs. I'm gonna kill you. The girls' eyes widened as Mojo threw the bombs. Quickly, they flew out of the way just as the bombs exploded. Without hesitation, they swooped down towards Mojo with anger-fueled vigor. But in a blink of an eye, Mojo dodged, letting them fly past. Suddenly, his armored boots began to shake and Mojo jumped up. Streams of fire and smoke emerged from the bottom of them, propelling Mojo into the air. This caused Mojo to fly towards Blossom, who he seized by the shoulders, taking her with him. Blossom, Bubbles and Buttercup shouted. Blossom gritted her teeth as her hands grabbed Mojo's arms. Pink energy blasted out of them, causing Mojo to reel back and let go. Once he did, Blossom landed a strong roundhouse kick on his stomach, sending him flying. Once he reached Bubbles and Buttercup, they each grabbed one of his arms, trapping him. Blossom landed in front of a struggling Mojo, glaring daggers at him. That's enough, Mojo Jojo. You obviously don't know what you're doing, so stand down. Even though it was clear that he was frustrated, Mojo grinned maliciously. Is that so? At that moment, his outstretched hands began to glow red. Before any of the girls could react, a large red-colored energy blast shot out of Mojo, sending the girls flying. As they landed on the ground, the girls flinched, as their bodies were now covered in the red energy. Mojo flexed his fingers with an evil chuckle. Amazing, isn't it? A suit of armor that dispels energy that can both damage the target and weaken the target's powers. As insufferable as those villains are, they do have the best materials available to make marvelous technology. After he said that, Mojo flew towards the girls, readying another attack. But just then, the energy on Buttercup faded, restoring her powers, which allowed her to force Mojo back with a green fire blast. Clearly enraged, Buttercup jetted after Mojo as he flew through the air from the blast, grabbed him, and threw him into the ground at full force. Too bad that stupid ploy of yours is temporary, Buttercup sneered. But just then, another red energy blast came from Mojo, forcing Buttercup back several feet. Quickly, Mojo got up and threw a bomb at Buttercup, which hit its mark, making her roll away and stop at Bubbles' and Blossom's feet. Buttercup, Bubbles gasped, distressed. After a few seconds, Buttercup's eyes fluttered open halfway, a pained expression on her face. So, that's what a bomb feels like, she whispered. Blossom knelt beside Buttercup, studying her before saying, I think the energy doesn't just deplete us of our powers, it weakens our invincibility too. As her eyes filled with tears, Bubbles glared and looked up at Mojo, who was readying to throw more bombs. You'll pay for that, Mojo. Before Blossom or Buttercup could stop her, Bubbles ran towards Mojo. As she did, she stuck out her right hand, and blue energy swarmed it, slowly forming into a large bubble wand. Once it fully formed, Bubbles leapt up into the air, just as Mojo threw the bombs at her. With an angry grunt, Bubbles swung the wand hard. Tiny bubbles flew from it, speeding towards the bombs with the same speed as bullets. Before the bombs could even get close, the bubbles tore them apart in a harmless puff of smoke. Not long after, Bubbles emerged from the smoke, aiming a blow at Mojo's head with the wand. But before she could land the attack, Mojo jumped away, his speed enhanced by the rocket boots. As Bubbles landed, Mojo stuck out his palms, firing balls of the crippling red energy. Bubbles was able to dodge most of them, but eventually one hit her hand. When it did, a pained yelp came from Bubbles as her hand inadvertently dropped the bubble wand, which evaporated as soon as it hit the ground. The red energy slowly spreaded from her hand to her wrist, as Bubbles watched it with horror. Bubbles, get back, Blossom shouted. As she heard the warning, Bubbles looked up just in time to see a bomb flying right towards her. But it was too late to move, and the bomb hit her head-on, sending her flying back into Blossom's arms. Blossom stared at her sisters in fear and shock as they tried their best to get up. Buttercup was sitting upwards now, but still clutching her sides and gritting her teeth in pain. Bubbles was crying as she tried to soothe her injured hand. And while all of this happened, Mojo Jojo stalked ever closer, with an evil grin on his face. And then, there was one. Mojo mused before chuckling. I gotta say, I'm disappointed. I expected more of an ass beating from you girls. But I guess I should thank you for holding back. Really shows that you care about me. Too bad it's not the same vice versa. Blossom slowly looked up, shaking with rage. What is wrong with you, Mojo? Even after everything that happened, even after landing in a world that is not your own, you're still stuck in your ways. Working with villains, terrorizing people, plotting to kill someone. When will you see that this is wrong? When will you see that these people, these new villains, are manipulating you? A look of malice crossed Mojo's face as he chuckled again. I appreciate the concern, Blossom. But you're wrong. I couldn't care less about these people, nor do I care about their hero. The only thing I care about is the fact that this world is much more advanced than our own. Blossom narrowed her eyes, confusion growing on her face. What are you talking about? Mojo stuck out his hands. Don't you see? This world is at its prime. The technology, the resources, it's all more advanced than anything I ever witnessed. It makes the state of our world look like the crap it is. Imagine what a powerful overlord can do with this place. Imagine what I, Mojo Jojo, can do if I rule it. But to rule, one must play a metaphorical game of chess. One must use what is given to them, and use it to their advantage to win. That is simply what I am doing. As the words registered, Blossom wanted to punch that stupid monkey in his face. So this is what Mojo Jojo wanted all along. To manipulate his way to the top and to toy with his allies to get what he wants, while not caring about who or what stands in your way. That is such a classic Mojo Jojo move. But despite the anger-provoking proclamation, Mojo saying that did wonders. Not just because it let Blossom know that Mojo hasn't changed a single bit, but also because it killed any remaining sympathy left in her. Which was why Blossom grinned to herself, for she was now excited to kick this fool's ass. Before Mojo could react, Blossom sprang at him, throwing him back with a single punch. With a gasp, Mojo skidded on the ground, completely shocked by the sudden attack. But Blossom made sure to not let him breathe, as she followed up with a pink energy blast. It was after recovering from that energy blast that Mojo was able to attack, throwing energy attacks of his own, with Blossom dodged with a succession of fluid and graceful maneuvers. As she dodged, her eyes locked onto Mojo's hands as they continued to let out periodic red pulses. Mojo had said that his suit was capable of producing the energy. So, it was natural that getting the suit would deactivate the red energy and render it useless. She just had to get close enough to land a good hit on it, preferably between the eerily red glowing circle engraved on the armor's chest. So when she was done dodging, Blossom raced towards Mojo in the blink of an eye, and thrusted her palm hard into the monkey's chest. The force of the attack sent Mojo flying into a building, his momentum slowing as he rolled on the ground. Blossom then propelled herself into the air, readying an energy blast just in case the force palm didn't do much. But as Mojo got up, he was laughing maniacally. I'll admit, it's impressive how you found out how the red energy was being generated, Blossom. It is not, however, an unpredictable move on your part, considering that I prepared for the scenario in which you try to take this power away from me. With that, Mojo spread his hands out to the side, and before Blossom could react, he started to shimmer with a red aura. His cape flickered back and forth in an unseen wind, and to Blossom's shock, the cape seemed to fall apart. With a start, she realized what Mojo's precaution was. It wasn't merely a cape made of fabric. It was made from some sort of nanotech, as trails of nanobots covered the suit, fortifying it in a translucent silver shell and therefore protecting the huge weak spot on Mojo's chest. Quickly, Blossom threw the pink projectile at him. Without batting an eye, Mojo caught the blast and glanced at it with amusement before grinning maliciously and throwing it back, brandishing it with his own red energy. It hit Blossom head-on as she fell to the ground on her feet, but she could barely recover as Mojo sprang at her with his rocket boots, taking her in his bone-crushing arms. With a great heave, Blossom pushed away, her strength weakened by the energy, but that only allowed Mojo to grab her wrist, spin her around, and throw her into the ground. Tried to kick my ass, did you? Mojo taunted as Blossom crawled to her knees with some difficulty. A piece of advice. Try harder, will you? I'm starting to pity you. To cement his statement, Mojo put an armored boot on Blossom's back and pressed her down to the dusty ground. As she groaned, Blossom looked ahead, wincing. There goes my rib. Come on, get up. Mojo goaded. He was loving this. If you can't face me, you can't hope to face what's ahead. Blossom scrunched her eyes closed as she screamed in anger. Why was this so hard for her? She should be the one digging her foot into Mojo's rib cage and pinning him down. And to think there were worse villains out there, fighting her currently helpless classmates. She needed to finish this. I guess that just shows me, Mojo mused, lessening the pressure of his foot off her back. You really have gone soft. Suddenly, Mojo was silenced by a loud bang, and the complete removal of pressure off of Blossom. And the lessening amount of red energy on her skin told Blossom that maybe she wasn't so doomed after all. Blossom got up and whirled around to see Buttercup herself, standing over a stunned Mojo, gold hammer in hand. After all this damn time, Buttercup huffed, you still talk too much. Mojo got up quickly, rubbing his head in fury and pain. Why you? As he got up and lunged for her though, Bubbles swooped in and threw a hook punch straight between Mojo's jaw, throwing him to the side. And that's what you get for hurting my sisters and my hand, she shouted. Blossom's eyes lit up. She wanted to hug her sisters and thank them profusely for saving her. But as she saw Mojo get up slowly in the corner of her eye, she realized that she had to beat this guy first. Quickly, Blossom moved to stand beside her sisters as they got into fighting positions. Okay, girls, so far, we've been going at Mojo one at a time. Why don't we switch it up and go all together? No mercy. Bubbles and Buttercup looked at Blossom with determined eyes. No mercy. And so, when Mojo finally got up, he was swiftly attacked by all three girls. With a slam of her hammer, Buttercup sent Mojo flying into Bubbles, who kicked him in the stomach, and toward Blossom, who grabbed the back of his neck and threw him down into the ground on his side. Shaking in rage and slight fear, Mojo raised a hand charging with red energy, but Blossom simply smirked wickedly. Not this time. Using 2 fingers, Blossom pressed hard into Mojo's chest, breaking the nanotech barrier with no problem and hitting the weak spot of the armor even harder than she had before. His own breath left Mojo instantly as he sputtered he would have been flying if Blossom didn't have a hold on him, and the red circle slowly stopped glowing and went black. It was only after it did when Blossom let him go. Mojo scrambled to sit up, gasping for air, as the Powerpuff Girls stood in front of him. After catching his breath, Mojo shared yet another gleeful smile. Oh, you think that since you stopped my suit from creating energy that I would be defenseless? You clearly forgot about my bombs. After he said that, Mojo reached down for his belt, only to realize with shock that it wasn't there. Huh? With an innocent smile, Bubbles slowly held up the silver belt. No, we didn't. Did you seriously not notice that your belt mysteriously went missing when you blasted me away? Or that it was strangely absent when you fought Blossom? Bubbles asked. She then took out a bomb, and to Mojo's terror and shock, popped it into her mouth and began to eat it. I gotta admit, these are pretty weak when they're not activated. So much so that they can be eaten as a great substitute for jawbreakers. Mojo Jojo stared at the Powerpuff Girls, who were now looking at him with accusatory glares, before slowly laughing and getting up. Only, this laugh was forced, as if he was trying to be friendly to avoid a beatdown, which was exactly what he was doing. Girls, have I ever told you that I love you, and that I would never try and hurt you? Mojo didn't get to finish before Buttercup swiftly kicked him between the legs, causing him to seize up and fall to his knees. As Mojo squeaked and made weird sobbing noises, Blossom and Bubbles looked at Buttercup with awe and pride, which made the latter shrug. What? Someone had to do it? She said simply. Well, thank you. You're doing God's work, Bubbles exclaimed. Bubbles, Blossom gasped, although she was in a fit of giggles. Mojo shook his head as big tears rolled down his cheek. You guys are cruel. After he said that, Blossom turned towards him, a big smile on her face. You know what, Mojo? You were right. I don't know how we were ever losing to you. No offense, but you're kind of nothing without the suit to help you. Mojo glared. You laugh now, girls. But soon, you won't be. In case you've forgotten, there's villains worse than I am out there as we speak, waiting to tear you apart. I'm just the first act. Buttercup scoffed. More like the prologue. No, more like a mini sneak peek, Bubbles added, giggling. We'll be fine. Thank you for your concern, Blossom said, throwing Mojo's own words back at him. Considering the possibility that a clown like you managed to coerce them in your plan of world domination, I'm convinced we're not dealing with a bright bunch. So while we're out saving our classmates and having decent morals, you... Before finishing, Blossom called up her hyper yo-yo and threw it at him. The yo-yo then wrapped around Mojo, the string binding his limbs together and trapping him. Blossom finally tied the yo-yo into a bow and looked up at him with a stern glare. We'll stay here. We'll come back for you when we're finished. Or better yet, pro-heroes, who are way more merciless than us, will come for you. Without sparing another word, the girls backed up and activated their flight, flying away from the ruins zone, as Mojo shouted after them. Try as hard as you want, girls, you can't save everyone, and you won't be able to save yourselves. Hey, chumps, take this, Buttercup shouted. After she said that, she launched herself off the ground a few feet into the air before coming down hot and thrusting her fists into the ground. This caused the earth below to split open, and for pieces of rock and ground to jut out, which sent some nearby goons flying in a concentrated earthquake. The girls had moved on from the ruins zone to the landslide zone in the Usja to simultaneously look for help and to look for their classmates. With its steep slopes and vast terrain, the girls had plenty of space to work with when it came to beating up villains, which is part of the reason why they were doing great at fighting. As the villains hit the ground unconscious, Blossom looked over from her battle. She was holding a beat-up villain by his shirt collar with some worry and alertness. Buttercup, be careful, she scolded. Buttercup looked over, incredulous. Oh, come on. You act like these bozos are capable of landing a hit on me. I'm more likely to get hurt by tripping over a pebble than by getting hurt by an attack from one of these guys. No, I mean, your attack left a few goons standing. Be more thorough with your follow-through, Blossom casually replied. Buttercup glanced over just in time to see two villains running towards her with knives at the ready. Oh, thanks, she said before stomping hard on the ground, shaking it enough to send the two goons falling flat on their faces. No problem, Blossom answered as she punched the villain just as he started to lift his hands towards her face. Bubbles, meanwhile, was waving her wand around elegantly, as villains left and right got trapped inside her indestructible bubbles. Stay in there, okay? We don't want you killing our friends, Bubbles chided gently whenever she passed a bubble with a seething villain. Once all of the villains in their area were cleared, Blossom shouted over to Bubbles. Do you see any of our classmates, Bubbles? She called. Bubbles shot a thumbs down. No, all I see are villains and more villains. Buttercup groaned. Ugh, this is taking forever. Why did the villains have to go and attack today? We could have been doing cool rescue exercises instead of this, and yet here we are. Well, technically we are doing rescue exercises. We're saving our class from villains. I bet Mr. Aizawa will give us extra credit since it's all real, Blossom pointed out. Bubbles slowed for a moment, looking a bit worried. Speaking of Mr. Aizawa, I wonder if he's doing all right. I hope the villains aren't winning, she sighed. Blossom and Buttercup slowly walked over, sharing a knowing glance. It was no doubt that Bubbles liked the class won a teacher. They did too. He was really the only person they talked to consistently the whole time they were here in this reality, and the one who used to check on them every day in that 10-month period. And despite his detached behavior, he did care about them and their classmates. They would hate it if anything bad were to happen to him. He'll be fine, Bubs. I mean, with a power that can completely cancel other powers? Ha, he's probably wiping the floor with them as we speak, Buttercup encouraged. Bubbles looked up, smiled, and nodded. Yeah, you're right. Just then, the girls heard a strange sound a short distance up ahead. It sounded almost like ice. As the sound stopped, they looked at each other. Classmates or villains? Bubbles asked. Buttercup punched her fist into her other hand with a mischievous smirk. I'm fine with either. Classmates are good to find. But villains mean more people to fight. Let's go then, Blossom declared. As they raced up the short hill, the girls stopped on top with wide eyes. Whoa, they whispered in unison. The land below was covered in cold ice. The ground was completely frozen, and jagged ice structures and icicles stuck out everywhere. The ice was looking thick and sharp enough to spear someone with little effort. Suddenly, they heard a new sound, only this time it was a voice. Momoko, Miyako, Kyoru, over here. The girls looked to see a pair of floating light blue gloves waving. At first, Blossom and Buttercup were confused, but Bubbles recognized the gloves immediately. Hagakure, Bubbles shouted gleefully. Quickly, Bubbles bounded across the icy terrain, with her sisters following seconds afterwards. Now that they were closer, they did see that it was the invisible girl classmate they knew. And a short distance away was Todoroki, as he came back towards the rest of his classmates. Are you guys okay? We've been looking for you, Blossom asked, concerned. Todoroki simply nodded his head, as Hagakure seemed to jump with delight. We're all right. We've been wondering where you three were. Where have you guys been? Buttercup crossed her arms. Smoke Monster sent us to the ruins zone. We got held up there by a villain, but we got him. We were looking around for the class. So were we. But we ran into some villains instead. We got rid of them though. Hagakure replied, before seemingly looking sheepish. Or, I guess I should be giving the credit to Todoroki. He froze everyone. Heh. As Blossom glanced at the ice everywhere, her eyes widened. Wow, this came from you? She asked, nonplussed. Yes, it was very easy to do so, Todoroki answered calmly, which goes to show just how dangerous these villains are. Bubbles tilted her head. What do you mean? These aren't villains we're fighting. They are more like low-scale criminals. Thugs who can be easily incapacitated, as proved from the fact that they are being bested by teenagers. The people who orchestrated this attack clearly are of obscurity, and are probably looking to gain public reputation as scary villains by doing this. Buttercup put a hand on her chin. So what you're saying is that these fellas are not a real threat? That explains why they were so easy to bulldoze. Blossom, meanwhile, looked skeptical. But how do you know for sure if they're not dangerous? Todoroki simply stuck his hands out in a motionless shrug, gesturing to the trapped villains in the bubbles slowly floating their way, the villains lying unconscious, and the villains trapped in melting ice. Do I need to explain? He asked. Blossom looked around before sighing and saying, I guess you're right. Just then, a booming sound drew the group's attention to the central plaza in the distance. I hope the guys taking on Aizawa are just thugs. He seems to be having some trouble there. Hagakure mused, concern in her voice. Todoroki frowned as he stepped forward. Since our side is clear, I'm going to go there to help. The quicker we take these villains out, the better our outcome is. Blossom nodded. Right, we can go with you. Wait, hang on, Hagakure exclaimed. You're gonna fight them. Haven't we done enough fighting? I think we'll be safe over by the Usk entrance. By the looks of it, I think they're safe. Hagakure then pointed to the entrance, where a few students were. Bubbles looked a little uneasy before speaking. I think we should avoid the plaza too. I don't think Mr. Aizawa would like us there. He wants us to stay away from the fighting, remember? Bubbles pointed out. Buttercup turned to her, frowning. Come on, Bubs, you can't chicken out now. We can manage by ourselves, you know that. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I agree with Buttercup. We gotta help, Bubbles, and this is the way to do it, Blossom urged. We can help, Blossom, I know that. Just not in this way. Bubbles insisted. Todoroki started to walk away. Whatever you guys decide, I don't care either way. I'm going. As he left, Blossom and Buttercup glanced from him back to Bubbles quickly, alert. But Bubbles held firm. You guys can go if you want. I'm not stopping you. But I am staying with Hagakure, and we'll go to the entrance together. Bubbles, Buttercup started to groan. But Blossom signaled for her to stop. It's fine, Buttercup. She then turned to Hagakure and Bubbles. You two stay safe, okay? Bubbles nodded. We will. I'll make sure. The two sisters stared for a second longer before taking off into the air in a flash of pink and green. Once they left, Bubbles gestured for Hagakure to follow. let's go. Together the two walked for a few moments before Hagakure said, "Wait, were you guys calling each other Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup?" Bubbles tensed. In the intensity of everything, their fake names completely slipped their minds. But she quickly played it off with a way too wide smile. Yeah. We called each other that as nicknames ever since we were little. It's a habit." She lied. Thankfully, Hagakure believed it. "Awa, that's so cute." Bubbles nodded, before letting out a secret sigh. That was close. In a few seconds, Blossom and Buttercup reached the central plaza. And along the way, they contemplated the battle ahead and how they would help. They wished that Bubbles had gone with them. Hagakure too. There was strength in numbers, and the addition of students fighting would really make a difference. But in a way, Bubbles was right. They didn't know what they were walking into. It could be too dangerous, even for a trio of superpowered girls from another world. Instantly, Blossom thought back to Mojo Jojo's words. "Try as hard as you want, girls. You can't save everyone, and you won't be able to save yourselves." These villains, despite what Todoroki said about them, seemed to be more than small-time thugs. What they were planning to do, killing All Might and killing the students, looked like something they were dead set on doing. This doesn't look like a ploy made with the purpose of intimidating the public. They looked like they really were going to fulfill that promise. And what had to be the most threatening, or at least the most alarming, part to the girls was the fact that the villains had Mojo. When considering his words and what formerly sounded like insipid bragging, it seemed very likely that Mojo shared some intel about the girls, more specifically, how to defeat them. Dread began to set in. Maybe the girls shouldn't have left Mojo alone. He was the only one who had answers to the questions they had. But he was in the ruin zone, possibly still tied up but possibly free. The girls were powerful, but they weren't omniscient. They had no clue if Mojo Jojo slipped away or not. Blossom shook her head a little. She shouldn't worry. Even if Mojo did escape, he could be easily stopped when help arrives. And help has to arrive, right? Someone will find out sooner or later what's going on. Suddenly, a tingling sensation hit Blossom like a truck. It was her danger sense, and it was screaming at her to move out of the way. "Buttercup, stop!" she shouted. But just before she finished, a huge beam of energy came hurtling up from below, right in the trajectory of Buttercup. Before it came close, however, Blossom tackled her sister out of the way, saving them both. Once they recovered, Buttercup looked bewildered and furious. "All right, who threw that?" she shouted. Blossom looked down at the battlefield to see a goon aiming at them with some sort of glowing arm cannon. More started to come up behind him, leering menacingly at the two girls floating above the central plaza. "Take a wild guess," she answered as she shot back a withering glare. "Let's beat their asses," Buttercup yelled. And with that, Buttercup swooped down towards them in a green blur, Blossom following closely behind in a pink blur. Before the thugs could attack them again, the two rammed into them, clearing a space for them to land. As the villains circled around them, Blossom and Buttercup stood with their backs against each other. Blossom started to rub her hands together so that they became burning hot. "Okay, Buttercup, let's do this. Ignite formation." With a wicked grin, Buttercup stuck her hand out towards Blossom's direction, and with incredible strength, Blossom slapped the hand. As they came into contact, both hands started to burn with wildfire as it spreaded up their arms. It was after that when they pulled away and towards the tide of villains. Buttercup called up some of her own green fire to mix with the other fire, creating an explosive product that she used to knock over some thugs. Blossom meanwhile focused on making the thugs scatter and trapping them with walls of fire. The whole thing took less than a minute, with most of the goons trapped and some of the tougher ones on the ground with second-degree burns. Once they were gone, Blossom and Buttercup put the fire out of their hands before high-fiving. "Nice ignite formation, Spice," Blossom complimented. Buttercup grinned. "Right back at you, everything nice." After that, Blossom looked around. The area around them was surprisingly devoid of thugs. "Where is everyone?" she asked. Just then, Buttercup froze after turning around in the opposite direction. She then touched Blossom's shoulder. "Bloss," she whispered, sounding worried for once as she pointed. Blossom whirled around and looked in the direction that Buttercup was pointing. In the distance, near the USG entrance, they could see their teacher, Aizawa. and they saw him getting beat up by a large and unfathomably scary creature of some sort. Without a word to spare, Blossom and Buttercup flew closer to the scene. But before fully approaching, Blossom grabbed Buttercup's arm, slowing them both down. As the latter looked at her sister in bewilderment, Blossom shook her head. "Don't attack yet. We need to know what we're dealing with. Let's hide over there," she whispered. She then led Buttercup to a small crater nearby, which was probably created due to the effect of a quirk, and crouched down. With analyzing eyes, Blossom surveyed the scene more closely, and what she ended up seeing completely horrified her. The monster was way scarier than she had first perceived. Towering above everything, its face was not a face, but rather a grotesque mouth and two huge bug-like eyes. The top of its head was gone, showing a large brain sticking out. It looked to be extremely muscular, as it knelt over Aizawa and pinned him there. But what had to be even worse was Aizawa's appearance. He had received a fresh cut flowing with blood. He looked like he was in extreme pain, with his limbs bent the wrong way due to the monster. He didn't look defeated, but he looked close to it. "Finally," Buttercup whispered, "and I thought the villains back at our world were scary. What the F is that?" Blossom shrugged helplessly, but at that moment, a memory hit her like a hammer. "And, believe it or not, they specifically wanted me. Me? Apparently they found out what a great scientist I am, and they wanted me to modify their monsters." The words that Mojo had said had a whole new meaning. Could this monster be the product of the villains and Mojo's combined efforts? Was this what they were creating and modifying? By the looks of it, they seemed to have made it very strong. That realization did nothing to put Blossom at ease. If anything, it made her want to throw up. But then, she noticed someone walking over. It was the man with blue hair and hands all over his body. As he walked over, he looked relaxed, almost gleeful. "I have to admit, Aizawa," he began to say in a raspy voice, "your quirk is powerful. A formidable one, given the fact that you can cancel others' power with just your eyes. But, despite your clear effort, your power is no match for Namu's." Buttercup frowned. "Nomu? That must be the monster," Blossom whispered, shivering slightly. Suddenly, they heard a crack, as Nomu grabbed Aizawa's right arm and broke it. It appeared that Aizawa was trying to erase Namu's quirk, but the latter didn't seem to be affected at all, as it had broken the arm with ease. "Why isn't this Nomu guy getting weaker, Mr. Aizawa's using his power, right?" Buttercup exclaimed, looking on in indignation. Blossom's eyes widened. "They must have modified Nomu to be immune to that somehow. Its power seems mostly concentrated in its strength, and I guess that Mr. Aizawa's quirk doesn't get rid of super strength." Buttercup narrowed her eyes. "So, Namu's kind of like All Might?" At those words, Blossom realized something else. The villains had talked about killing All Might, but they themselves were easily defeatable. But they weren't going to kill All Might. Nomu was not kind of like him. Exactly like him, Blossom answered. Buttercup was quiet before saying, "Shit, they're really serious. They're really gonna kill All Might." Blossom was quiet. She and her sisters had not known the pro-hero for long, but in the short time they were acquainted, All Might had shown them nothing but respect and kindness, and these villains wanted to kill him. The thought of it made Blossom's fingers dig deep into the ground in rage. "Not if we can help it," she whispered. At that moment, something spontaneously appeared, catching everyone's eyes. It was a small dark purple speck that suddenly grew into the smoke monster that was Kurogiri. "Tamura, we have a problem." The man, Tamura, looked at Kurogiri. He looked a little annoyed, probably because Kurogiri interrupted something. "What is it, Kurogiri?" he snapped. Kurogiri looked a little uneasy before saying, "Back at the exit, I was able to incapacitate the pro-hero guarding the class. She tried to fight, but ultimately, I put her out of commission." Blossom's heart dropped. "No, 13. But, during the fight," Kurogiri continued, "one of the students was able to get past me with the help of a few others. He escaped and is going back to Ua High to call for backup." Almost immediately, Blossom felt hope in her chest. They had a chance. Thanks to their classmates, someone was getting help. Maybe they could win this in the end. And it seemed like Tamura realized that too. Weirdly, his hands immediately flew up to the pale, flaky skin of his neck and started to scratch it furiously. No, no, you fool, you let one of them get away. Now the pro heroes are going to come here and skin us alive. I swear, I'd kill you if it weren't for your stupid quirk. But as it looked like Tomura was about to have a meltdown, he strangely calmed down faster than he flared up. You know what? It's fine. That's fine. Well, since the pro heroes are coming in great numbers, it's clear that we need to retreat and regroup. We'll get our opportunity to kill All Might sooner or later. With that, Tomura turned around and walked away from Nomu and Aizawa, the former of which lessened its hold slightly on Aizawa. As the two walked away, Buttercup seemed to collapse in relief. I knew it, Buttercup rejoiced. I knew that these wimps weren't worth our time. Just the idea of heroes coming to help scared them off. I guess that's the end of that, huh, Bloss? Blossom, however, was not as relieved as she frowned. Wait, something seems wrong. I don't think they're going to leave this easily. Not after they dedicated themselves to killing us. Blossom mused, still tense. Buttercup realized that and looked uneasy for a second before dismissing it with a shake of her head. Maybe they realized that they had done enough of making a statement. I mean, they got Mr. Aizawa. That seems like a grave enough warning, right? Buttercup said, even though her voice seemed uncertain. Suddenly, Tomura stopped in his tracks, drawing the attention of the two girls and Kurogiri, who slowed as well. Tomura? Kurogiri asked, clearly surprised by the sudden stop of movement. Tomura was quiet for a while before saying, actually, the more I think of it, the more I believe that we're letting the heroes off too easily. All Might deserves to have his stupid pride injured. At this, he turned his head to look at the edge of the central plaza. And standing right there were three people that Blossom and Buttercup didn't see at all. Wait, that's Izuku and Isui, Blossom gasped in shock. And Minda too? What the hell are they doing here? Buttercup added, getting up a little from her crouched position. But Blossom was more worried at the fact that Tomura was starting to go towards them. A dead student or two will do just the thing, he shouted. After that, it seemed like things moved in slow motion. Tomura lunging for Tsuyu, everyone staring in terror and shock, and Aizawa shouting for her to move. But as he reached a hand towards her mortified face, Tomura looked like he was very close to killing her. That is until a blue flash comes out of nowhere, and Tomura is thrown to the side. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 4. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author PeriwinkleFrog on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.